Have you ever owned a Vauxhall, Kamal?
I haven't, but I did have a friend, Adam. He owned a pale yellow Vauxhall Cavalier, which was the car of choice for young men in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He had a baseball bat under his seat because the tough streets of Ealing, West London, were not to be messed with.
Amazing. Yeah, I used to hang around with some boys back in the 90s who had bass tubes in the back of their Vauxhall Astras. Really cool. I personally drove a Vauxhall Nova. But we were purveyors of Vauxhall, and as I said earlier, quite a big part of my childhood, just knowing how significant it was to have the Vauxhall plant in the town next door. It was basically the life and soul of Luton at that time. Thousands and thousands of people employed there. We had a bit of a double whammy yesterday because we had the announcement that Spitalfields was closing down in central London, which has been a meat market there for 900 years. And now this end of another era. And you know who I'm blaming for it all?
Edward Miliband.
Ed Miliband. I'm blaming him, but I'm also blaming a little bit Boris Johnson, because some of these targets, this is what happens when ideology hits reality square in the kahunas. Okay? Car manufacturers say, hang on a minute. First of all, can anyone work out where these arbitrary targets came from? Literally, people's backsides. Politically, as far as I can tell. We've shifted these sands, haven't we? It should be petrol and diesel free by 2040. Oh no, let's make it 2035. No, let's make it 2030. No, let's make it 2035 again. But the bottom line is that despite all of these great ideas that are born out of COP conferences and all the rest of it, the car manufacturers themselves are saying customers don't want these electric vehicles. So we're now in dire straits and we're making people redundant. How is this progress?
Boris Johnson, as you say, was one of the big proponents of supposed green policies to try and tackle climate change. The idea that the world is heating is now not much disputed. Some people do dispute some of the figures, but not much disputed. We've seen around the world the floods, even in the UK, the increased incidence of very, very destructive weather. The government then makes a decision we need to push for this idea of what's called net zero, and it looks at the things that create most pollution, one of which is the cars we drive. And then, as you say, policy then runs so far ahead of the public. The big issue for the government, the big issue for all green campaigners, and we've talked about this before, Camilla, they have never taken the public on the journey that the public thinks it wants to go on. Electric cars are much more expensive. The infrastructure is not there. Many people who buy electric cars have actually gone back to petrol cars. I very recently bought a new car and I was quietly advised to get a petrol car because even in London, the charging structure is not there. There is too much risk and anxiety. So you're paying more for your car, and it is actually not as flexible as a petrol car. Lots and lots of people have moved away from diesel, the most polluting. So it's not that the public don't want to make progress, but you've got to make progress at a pace that the public understand. And as Margaret Thatcher famously said, you can't buck the market. The demand for electric vehicles is simply not there.
When you say you were quietly advised, what happened? Did the car showroom man or woman say, look, we've got these EVs out the front, but come out the back. I've got a couple of petrols and diesels if you want to take a look.
They really wanted me to have an electric vehicle, but when you went through the financing, the cost, the expense, where I live in North London, it's not badly served for electric charging posts, but every night you get home and they're all full. So therefore, you can't charge your car overnight. We don't have a driveway. We live in a semi-detached, or no, we live in a terraced house. So people in terraced houses, much less access, much less space. If you live in flats, almost no access to charging points. And in many poorer parts of the country, in cities, and also in large parts of rural UK, there is simply no infrastructure. So the government set targets when they could not be delivered because the public doesn't want to be in a position where it can't get from A to B. And that's not just for those leisure journeys. For many millions of people around the country, particularly outside the big cities and particularly outside the capital, this really matters for work. If you can't get to work, you can't do your job.
Kamal, should we have a little trip down memory lane? about who first brought this in, because there's been a bit of argy-bargy about whose fault this all is. So the government first announced a ban on sales of new petrol and diesel cars by 2040 back in 2017. That was Michael Gove's idea when he was the Environment Secretary under Theresa May. Then after COP26 in Glasgow, that was February 2020, Boris Johnson announced, with a bit of encouragement from his wife, I would imagine, who's quite green friendly, that should be being brought forward to 2035, arguing that you couldn't achieve net zero by 2050 otherwise. Fast forward to November of 2020, Johnson then, the keynote, brought it forward to 2030. Sunak then said, no, let's push that back to 2035 again. Then Labour came into power, promising to push ahead with the 2030 target. So under that ZEV mandate, ZEV, what's that, Kamal?
Zero-emission vehicles.
Thank you so much. You're so green. Car companies.
I've got a petrol car, Camilla.
I know, so have I.
Don't tell anyone.
I don't tell anyone. I've got a diesel, but I do add that AdBlue, and I've got a petrol. I've got a diesel and a petrol.
Oh, you got two cars,
I'm
right?
doubly
Great.
bad. Well, no,
Yeah.
I'm saying Dom's got a diesel. That's the Land Rover. That's the family car. I've got a Mini, which is my car, and that's petrol. I can't do electric because what if I was sent on a job to Skegness? And I can't.
Regular occurrence.
Well, to be fair, we do get out and about a bit.
Do.
I mean, journalists can't really have electric cars. You never know where you're going to be from 1 minute to the next. Anyway, so under that ZEV mandate, car companies face hefty fines if they do not hit targets that require 22% of their sales to come from EVs this year, a figure that will gradually rise to hit 80% in 2030.
The word gradually there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, these are very rapid increases in electric vehicle sales, and actually consumer demand for electric cars has failed. Just 18% of new cars sold so far this year have been electric. So what you are doing is classic, first of all, policy confusion, backwards and forwards, 2040, 2035, 2030, 2035. If you're a car manufacturer building factories, it's not like you're producing sort of bread for the next day. You're producing production lines, massive amounts of industrial processes, manufacturing, and then you're told, oh no, it's this target. Oh no, sorry, it's that target.
Yeah.
So first of all, you have the policy problem there for the actual sector, the supply. That's one issue. And then they've also made the demand a problem because the public simply won't buy. So you're enforcing these fines on car companies, £15,000 per car that they don't, if they don't hit their targets. That could be multiple billions of pounds in fines for the car sector in the UK by 2030. They have to get to 80% of all the cars they sell in the UK by 2029 need to be electric vehicles. You simply cannot ramp up production in that way on the supply side and on the demand side, because we are still, for example, one of the cheapest producers of electric vehicles is China. And of course, we are very wary of allowing huge amounts of Chinese cars to come here, even though they're a lot cheaper, because of our relationships with China, which, as Ian Duncan-Smith told us on the podcast, we need to be very careful about. So on the supply side and on the demand side, this has been a complete failure of policy. And it doesn't need to be either net zero or not net zero, but you have to get there in a gradual way, because in the end, the UK is 1% of global emissions. If you can't drive out all car making in the UK on the altar of something which will have de minimis effect on climate change globally.
Shall we listen to Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer having a knockabout about this and whose fault it is at PMQs earlier today?
Mr. Speaker, the investment he's taking credit for was our work. I was business secretary. We negotiated those deals that he announced. But the bottom line is that in all that he has said, he doesn't seem to care about the young people who will lose their jobs as a result of his budget. Perhaps he can show more concern for the 1,100 people who found out yesterday that they could lose their jobs at Vauxhall's plant in Luton. So while he flies around making unilateral commitments, back home, the real-world effects are businesses closing in Bedfordshire and Basildon. Does the Prime Minister stand by his promise to ban the sale of petrol cars by 2030, even if more jobs will be lost?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't normally invite a heckle, but that one was accurate. Mr. Speaker, the question of the position of jobs in Luton is a very serious one, and families and workers will be very worried, and we are obviously engaging with them. I would remind the Leader of the Opposition that the EV mandates that are an issue in this particular case were actually introduced by the last government. I would also remind her that she was the business secretary that introduced them.
It's exactly your point, Camilla. Both governments of both Conservatives and Labour have pushed a policy that simply isn't working, and they need to reverse out of it.
There has been some hint of a U-turn. Smell a little bit of Labour rubber on the road, because Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, was at the Business and Trade Committee yesterday and said this.
Thank you. And just staying on that point of coordination, and you would expect me to say this as a champion of manufacturing and of automotive, we have been hearing for months and for years the problems that our motor manufacturers are having with the electric vehicle mandate. Is there going to be change on that soon? I certainly hope so.
Yes, well, this is a very significant priority, and I think you will be almost certainly aware by now of the news from Stellantis and obviously the news from Ford.
Yes.
Last week. This is a very difficult day for Luton, particularly. I feel in a whole range of areas, and I'll say a bit more on this. I'm actually at the SMMT's annual dinner this evening, that we have got to not in any way undermine the transition that we know we have to get to, in this case, around electric vehicles. I think that the previous intervention from the previous Prime Minister and the impact that had on consumer confidence was very much regrettable. But we've got to make sure policy is working in the way that gets us there. And I don't see any tension between being committed to that transition and to UK manufacturing. I've said repeatedly that for me, decarbonisation cannot mean deindustrialisation. I've got no interest in the country hitting its climate targets by shutting down jobs and industry. That's just not the way it's got to be about that transition. And so, yes, myself and the Transport Secretary, who I work with very closely around this, are looking at that particular policy, that ZEV mandate, to make sure it's operating in such a way that allows British manufacturing to get to that destination. And there'll be a consultation announced in due course on an expedited timescale that allows us to consider, is that policy currently operating as anyone expected it to? I don't think it is, and I get the seriousness and the urgency of the situation.
This is where there's public frustration, Camilla. He says, I do not want net zero to lead to deindustrialisation. That is literally what is happening. So Ford have announced already closures in the UK because of these new targets. Honda has said that car manufacturing is getting harder and harder and has announced job losses. In Europe, Volkswagen, one of Germany's most famous businesses and incredibly important employer, not only in Germany but all around the world, is having real difficulty changing its business model to move into electric vehicles. It is bringing deindustrialisation. Either the government needs to be honest about that and say that's a price worth paying, or it needs to reverse. It is unlikely that it will do a full reverse. It says it still wants to hit this 2030 target. It is actually a manifesto commitment, but maybe they can reduce the fines and that can give them a little less impact on their bottom line.